Merci beaucoup Sandra pour ce panorama et ces résultats des élèves en CP et CE1 en France. Maintenant, j'ai le plaisir d'accueillir un professeur de psychologie de l'Université de New York, Hiro Yoshikawa, qui va nous faire une présentation qui va revenir un petit peu plus tôt dans la vie d'un élève. L'intitulé de sa présentation est From Cradle to Kindergarten. Et c'est un plaisir pour moi. On va passer en anglais. We switch to English right now. We are pleased to welcome Hiro Yoshikawa for this presentation. Thank you.
Merci bien pour l'accueil. I'm going to now speak in English. I co-direct a center at New York University called Global Ties for Children, and we focus on programs and policies for children and youth in low and middle income countries as well as conflict-affected countries. But I'll be talking today about work that cuts across rich countries like the United States and ties to issues of inequality, which we just heard quite a bit about from the French context, but I'll be speaking mainly about the United States and then contexts affected by conflict and the learning of refugee children. I'll also focus on a period of development that includes the CP years of 0 to 6 years old. And we all know that these years are very, very important from the standpoints of brain development, particular sensitivity to environmental influence and the influences of home and other learning opportunities in communities. So, and then the broad topic will be also when and under what circumstances can research evidence make a difference in public policies for young children. So I'm going to start with a brief summary of what a foundation in the United States has commissioned, which is about 15 years of research on when research makes a difference in public policy. I think we may all have some opinions that are pretty skeptical about whether public policy makers pay attention to research, whether in the field of education or really any other field. But it turns out that this is now an active area of research in and of itself. So I'll tell you some of the brief lessons from that. Then I'm going to talk about the application of those lessons in some large-scale work, one of which is a humanitarian initiative to support Syrian refugee children, Rohingya refugee children, and Venezuelan refugee children in the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America. And then the last example will be the example of developing national multi-year policy proposals and what role could researchers possibly play in actually contributing directly to legislation. So starting with the first topic, what does research on the use of evidence in policy tell us? So the William T. Grant Foundation in the United States is the main research foundation focused on youth development, defined as children and youth between the ages of 6 and 25. And about 15 years ago, their senior vice president, Vivian Teng, decided to start a program of research that really hadn't existed in any coherent way until then, which is in what situations, under what circumstances is research evidence actually used in policy. So rather than kind of take you through a bunch of studies, I am going to tell you what seems to work and what seems to not work in this relationship between research and policy. But the lesson here is that policy gets made in human relationships. And this was a story told to me by a vice minister of finance in Peru, who was in that position 3 separate times over the last 20 years. He, in his first time within the Ministry of Finance in a leadership position, realized that all important decisions get made in small groups. So he decided after he left to go to Argentina and be trained in group therapy and learn how small groups of humans interact so that he could bring that back into the policy world. And then he did. He went back into the Ministry of Finance in Peru. He was very instrumental in both the transparency, the financial transparency policies of Peru, and he became a very strong advocate for early childhood development policies, which is how I met him. So that story really struck with me. He was a very unusual person on a lot of fronts, but that was that kind of breadth of thinking and realizing that policy does not happen in a purely kind of rational way, but happens through the influence of small groups, interactions of small groups of humans. Of course, this happens in contexts of larger socio-political and ideological change. It can be influenced by social movements that may have nothing to do with research, but everything to do with social justice. Policymaking occurs in interactions that involve meaning making that is deeply influenced by cultural factors and assumptions, as well as political processes. And again, we don't often research these mechanisms. So what do these 15 years of grants and research projects tell us? What does not work? We often, as researchers, write an article, and the last 2 paragraphs we might say, oh, here are some implications for policy or program or practice. That is not in and of itself going to have any influence on policy. Simply translating your findings into simpler language when communicating by itself is not going to influence policy. Policy briefs, which some of us write, which is we'll take an article and then we'll make a 2 or 3 page version of it designed to communicate to policymakers, in and of themselves, again, often don't necessarily work. Single events or single occasions, for example, an op-ed opinion piece in a newspaper can have some influence, but again, all of these look like they're inadequate because they don't consider the notion of these relationships and things like what this Peruvian Minister of Finance learned. And so the most productive relationships of research to policy occur in sustained and reciprocal partnerships with networks of policymakers. They come from a standpoint of knowing what policymakers' questions are, and starting by meeting them where they are in terms of their concerns, and then bringing research, and perhaps actually conducting research in response to their question, rather than completing your own research and then hoping that it answers a policymaker's question. So it's through this reciprocal interaction, often over years, because there's another issue, which is the windows for policy action are often extremely limited and rare. And so the opportunities to actually influence programming, in this case, educational or early childhood development policies at scale, come along very rarely. So what can work in this context? In our experience at our center, where we've worked with something like 25 different countries around the world, multi-year partnerships with small groups of people who've had experience in policy leadership positions, but might not right now be in them, are what we understand is particularly useful. Because in many of the countries in which we work, but I think this is also true in France or in many rich countries, you can work with a particular vice minister in education or a particular colleague, but they may be out of that position within 9 months, 12 months, 18 months. In Latin America, the average tenure of a minister of education or social sector minister is about 18 months. So trying to keep in touch with the networks of individuals who move in and out of government. They might move from government to a civil society organization or to a university or to a policy institute, and then go back into policy. Those kinds of folks really have the depth of understanding across years, and staying in touch with them and waiting for those policy windows when they might have influence, when a particular kind of research evidence might be useful, can be really important. It does mean that you can just continue doing the research that you would do, but you want to make sure that it does have some relevance to an enduring policy question. And then jump in when the policy window opens and be ready with summaries of your research. And in that case, then that's when the briefs, the meetings, the single events can be very, very important. And then later I'm going to talk about how is it that we could actually get engaged in the language of legislation. One interesting study that was commissioned or funded by the William T. Grant Foundation was actually an experimental evaluation of an effort to influence policymakers with research evidence that actually used some of these principles of building relationships. So this involved, first of all, getting a needs assessment to really start, again, where the policymakers are, understand what their needs were in Congress. And they invited all congressional offices to participate in this process and then have access to networks of researchers that would work with them in topic areas related to children and families. And then this effort also recruited the researchers to work in these small networks with congressional offices to inform them around the particular child and family policy topics they were interested in. So 96 congressional offices, of which 59% were on the Democratic side, for any of you interested in that, were randomized to this intervention or to a light touch control condition, which was publicly available research briefs. 226 researchers were randomized to the intervention or to a traditional kind of more static policy engagement curriculum. There were positive impacts after 6 months on congressional office staff perceptions of the usefulness of conceptual use of research evidence, which is this idea that research can help me rethink policy, but not necessarily instrumental use of research evidence, which is that research that helps you make a particular policy decision between A and B. Right? So something along those lines, or tactical use of research evidence, which is the use of research evidence to express one strongly held position in opposition to another strongly held position, right? So that's like engaging more directly in kind of politics. So the staff perceptions of the general use of, okay, this is useful conceptually to me to understand this area of policy was what was improved. There was no difference in how many bills were introduced around this area of child and family policy, but of those bills introduced, 23% more of the offices that were assigned to treatment cited actual research. So they did a text analysis of all the bills that were proposed to see, okay, in the footnotes, is there like a research, are there research articles that are cited? And so this showed that there were some increases in the citation of research among the congressional offices that had been assigned to treatment. The second example I wanted, well, the first actual example was that one. The second one I want to talk about is about partnering with ministries in the humanitarian sector in an initiative called Ahlan Simsim, which is a very large initiative that has was funded for the last 6 years by the MacArthur Foundation. So first want to note that there are at least 3 kinds of policy or practice systems involved in humanitarian settings, which is that the host government policies, the refugee communities, social structures, and then also the humanitarian sector systems, which are often coming out of UN agencies or NGOs that are international NGOs, usually coordinated by the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, UNHCR. Most humanitarian NGOs stepping into this area are doing rapid response services in areas where governments call the UN in and say, we cannot serve this population with our existing resources. So the UN steps in and coordinates a response in particular geographic areas with refugee influx. What that means is that the humanitarian NGOs are often kind of only in a country temporarily or to support that refugee population, and they're not actually working with the national ministries. But I'm going to argue that this initiative was able successfully to work with the host government ministries in order to have more of a sustained impact that addresses all the needs of students and children in the country, not just the refugee population. So these are two very large initiatives, each funded at the level of $100 million, of which the first, the MacArthur Foundation, funded a large-scale competition for a single solution on a critical social issue called the 100 and Change Initiative. And the first partnership that was funded through 100 and Change was a partnership between Sesame Workshop and the International Rescue Committee to provide early childhood development services in this sector that really had virtually none up to that point, which is the humanitarian sector. So overall, only 3% of humanitarian sector funding goes to education. And that's because, for a lot of very good reasons, the emphasis in humanitarian aid is on survival. So on health and nutrition and shelter and clothing and food. And education becomes an afterthought. Within that 3% of education funding, early childhood development for programs like preschool education or support of caregivers and parenting programs is much, much smaller. So it's really a fraction of humanitarian sector funding. And so these initiatives were meant to start to address that gap by providing services to three large refugee flows: the Syrian refugee crisis in the Middle East, the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh, and then secondarily the Venezuelan refugee crisis in Latin America. So our role at NYU was to evaluate some of the service models that were provided, and so we did run 5 experimental evaluations, and I'm going to take you through one of them just because we're very excited by its results, and then tell you a little bit about these ministry partnerships. So this one is about a remote early learning program implemented with rural and remote Syrian refugees, families in Lebanon who had zero access to preschool education, both because of their refugee status and because they were in unusually rural and remote areas of Lebanon. The International Rescue Committee had already been providing in-person services in early childhood prior to the pandemic, but these areas were too rural or remote, even for that very experienced NGO to be providing on-the-ground services. So when COVID occurred, of course, there was this transition to remote learning, and any of you who can imagine what a remote preschool classroom teaching might look like, you can imagine a bunch of children on Zoom, and the teacher unmutes everybody, and what do you think happens? Probably not a whole lot of learning, right? So the International Rescue Committee's Lebanon program team actually created a very innovative model to address this issue, which is preschool teachers with experience teaching preschool education, working with small groups of caregivers, about 5 to 6 caregivers in each group, on WhatsApp, and engaged with them 3 times a week for about 35 or 40 minutes for 11 weeks. And so the preschool curriculum was actually implemented by caregivers, not by teachers, but the teachers acted as coaches. And so the children and the parents would show up on WhatsApp. They would turn the video on, but for very short periods of time, because in Lebanon there was actually, at this point, lots of crises going on, right? There's an economic collapse. There are electricity shortages. And so to conserve Wi-Fi, the videos were turned on briefly, but that way the caregivers would recognize each other, the children would recognize each other, they would see the teacher, and then the teachers would guide the caregivers through learning activities. What was sent home, the only physical aspect of this program, was a backpack full of learning materials, which were sent home, and caregivers and children were literally jumping up and down with this. This was like school to them. And the caregivers really perceived this as their opportunity, their only opportunity to actually access school, kind of regardless of the pandemic, but especially during the pandemic. The teachers scheduled these calls at times that worked for the caregivers, and if a caregiver missed because of the, let's say, electricity went out, the teachers would follow up with one-on-one calls, sometimes late into the evenings. So these were some of the, it's a traditional, it's a curriculum called Preschool in a Healing Classroom that's based on a traditional holistic way of supporting early language, early numeracy, early social emotional learning that the IRC had been implementing with some pretty good success in Lebanon in person for about 7 years before they did this. It also integrated materials developed by Sesame Workshop, from their Ahlan Simsim television show, which this grant also supported, which was a new production of Sesame Street that focused for the first time on a particular humanitarian context, and that was a co-production with Jordan Pioneers, a children's media NGO in Jordan. We also had a third arm, which was tested against a control group, which is testing the added impact of a light touch once-a-week parent and caregiver-focused call that was not the preschool teacher, but an early childhood development facilitator. So we have 3 arms to the study. Remote early learning program, again, this is 11 weeks. The remote early learning program plus Ahlan Simsim families, which is that parenting component, and then the control group, which received the remote learning program after the completion of the RCT end line. So what did we find? We found large improvements in all the domains of child development measured by a well-validated measure called the IDELA of Save the Children, and these are percentage correct on different scales measuring specific domains on the IDELA, with the largest effects being in emergent literacy, emergent numeracy, and social emotional development. So improvements of 10 to 15 percentage points in the percentage correct in these domains. And for those of you who speak effect sizes, these are effect sizes that are quite large, between 0.21 and 0.49, with again literacy, numeracy, and social emotional learning being the largest ones. These are effect sizes we would normally expect from in-person preschool in low and middle income countries on these domains over a full preschool year. And this was accomplished within 11 weeks, again with preschool teachers working with small groups of caregivers, but actually the caregivers implementing these activities. And of course, there was a large effect on caregivers' own report of engaging in kind of learning activities and play activities with their children. And then I think because of the context of partnerships with ministries, and in particular the Ministry of Education in Iraq, the Ministry of Education in Iraq commissioned a pilot implementation of this after hearing about the results from this impact evaluation. So this included areas that had been deeply affected by conflict within the last 8 to 10 years in Iraq, including Mosul, and we found that the gains in the IDELA, the same measure, were comparable in magnitude to gains in the treatment group of the Lebanon RCT of quite large increases in each of these domains on the IDELA. Children with different family displacement statuses showed similar improvements in IDELA scores, those who were internally displaced, those who had returned. In this case, Iraq, most of the war caused internal displacement and the kinds of conflicts that were going on. But it helped everybody, including the host community. And the most interesting thing here is that even though parents with low levels of education or even non-literate parents, their children started with very low levels, lower levels of percent correct on these domains, the positive effects occurred regardless of the parent's education or literacy level. And this is also a pattern we saw in Lebanon, which is that among the group of parents who were not literate, the effects on early literacy, numeracy, and social emotional learning were just as large. And some of the caregivers, in fact, told us that they were actually learning some of the Arabic words alongside their children when the preschool teacher was working with them. So this is one of the important lessons, is that caregivers with the lowest levels of literacy and education, their children can still benefit from a program that relies on them to implement preschool-type playful activities at home. So this is the first impact evaluation of a remotely delivered short-term preschool program, and so we think it has a lot of relevance for ministries that might not have the resources to scale preschool education fully across the country, with large potential for use in hard-to-access remote or rural contexts. And this replication effort in Iraq was not possible without the context of partnerships with 9 ministries across the 4 countries in this initiative, which has meant that they have been able to sustain the reach so that it will continue. The program, aspects of the program, which is a whole, there's not a single program, but a lot of kind of curricular models and materials and training models for health workers, teachers, child care workers, for example, can be used and are being used even after the grant formally ends. And there has been a report on how this scaling occurred with ministries, and the lesson, and this means that at least 1 million children are projected to be continue to be served after the grant period in terms of services. And there's strategies in that report. Some of the lessons they say are very much in line with what the William T. Grant Foundation research shows, which is if ministries take ownership and are responsible for financing, the originating organization, which in this case is the International Rescue Committee, plays a catalyzing role but not the dominant role in terms of scaling a program, that there is this kind of notion of handover. The models that were developed by Ahlan Simpson were also done in alignment with national standards set by the 9 ministries. And really importantly, this was the first time the International Rescue Committee in a country or regional context had hired a full-time person only for partnerships. And that full-time person woke up every day developing partnerships with the ministries in the region. And those were successful with 9 of them across ministries of health, education, social welfare, and others. So the final example I want to make is whether researchers can actually get involved in legislation and kind of proposing national policies. And I think I'm going to propose that this is kind of a neglected role for interdisciplinary teams of scholars who have the right sets of skills. One of my mentors in this kind of work is Emily Vargas Barón, who's worked with about 40 or 45 countries around participatory processes to develop national ECD, early childhood development policies. But our example is an example that was initially written for the United States called Cradle to Kindergarten, which was an integrated, costed early childhood care and education national policy proposal for the United States. And just to set some context, the United States has no national early childhood development policy in this critical area of care and education. It has fragmented pieces of policies, reaching really a fraction of those eligible, but not in any kind of universal way, as is true here in France with the preparatory period of education that starts at age 3 here. So we did set this in the context of national data on inequality. These are data on kind of student achievement across primary and secondary schooling, showing that the gaps between the lowest income 10% of households and the top 10% of income earning households are large and growing, and that over The last 40 years, those gaps grew particularly between the 50th percentile and the 90th percentile, which is the middle of the income distribution and the wealthiest, so that that gap now is as large as the gap between the poorest 10% and that 50th percentile. And these are in reading and math scores, integrating about 8 or 9 national data sets that Sean Reardon put together to show this kind of historical trend in inequality in the United States. When we see these kinds of patterns of inequality, we do think that there's an opportunity to gain the political support of the middle class, who increasingly cannot afford childcare, for example, in the United States. Childcare accessibility is not just an issue for the poor in the United States, but it actually is an issue that goes way up into the middle class. So our 4 areas of policy were paid parental leave, a reliable guarantee of childcare assistance, universal early education that would start at age 3, like it does here in France, and reimagining the current federal preschool program called Head Start to both begin much, much earlier and to focus on the most vulnerable families and to shift to a family support and early learning model. So paid parental leave, I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, though I realize that parental leave might be one of the areas that this is actually relevant in France because your period of support is relatively short. But the details, the point is that we worked out in each of these areas has a chapter, and it works out all the details we would want to see from a particular policy area. And that's because our team had expertise. Taryn Morrissey had particular expertise in parental leave and childcare. A.J. Chaudhry, the first author, had particular experience with childcare policy. Christina Weiland had particular experience, and I had particular experience with preschool policy. Then in childcare, we did provide, it is a research-based book, so when relevant, we would provide new research evidence, and in this case, it was research evidence that for childcare, an issue is not just inequality in access, but also inequality in the quality of that childcare. So these are actual observations of childcare programs utilized in large-scale data sets, national data sets of families with children at the age of 2. And the reason these bars are all below 0 is they are all comparisons to the level of quality experienced by the top 20% income quintile of households in the United States. And we see that the level of quality in home-based care of 2 types, relative care or non-relative care, as well as center-based care is simply lower. The lower your income is as a household. So we present some of this new evidence to provide and do a comprehensive, of course, review of all the evaluation literature to show what might work in a particular policy area. With childcare, the most important point here is that no family should have to pay for childcare more than 7% of their annual income. And currently, many families are spending between 20, upwards of even 25% of their household income on childcare, particularly for childcare for children below the age of 3, which is much, much more expensive because the groups have to be smaller, the ratio of children to adults has to be smaller, and children's developmental needs, as I think Liz is going to talk about next, are just simply more intensive during these first years of life. And then a universal early education for 3- and 4-year-olds. In the United States, public schooling essentially starts at age 5. So we have a slightly different structure, but this would be about providing universal early education for 3- and 4-year-olds. And then finally, that COVID-19, but even without COVID-19, the need for intensive family support for the most disadvantaged families is extremely important. And so this is about kind of redirecting the federal preschool program. If the federal government provides funding to states for universal preschool, then they can use the current federal preschool program and move it down to start at birth and then focus on the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in the United States to provide those services. A really important point I wanted to make is that A.J. Chaudhry had experience running, he's an academic and a professor, but he also ran the child care program for New York City. He worked in the Obama administration and led the development of their preschool proposal. And when that proposal did not go through as planned, he decided he wanted to put all of his kind of policy thoughts into this book and work with the three of us, because we had the technical expertise in these particular areas of childcare, parental leave, and preschool, to then work together on a proposal that would make all of these very detailed decisions about incentives and basic program costs and workforce support and professional development and training costs, and actually develop a 10-year cost proposal. So when we first published the book, it had actually a less ambitious proposal, but in 2021 we had a second edition under the Biden administration, and the possibility came true to actually have a policy that was actually even more ambitious than this one, because the COVID and its stimulus provoked kind of unprecedented levels of government spending on, in the social sector in the United States. These were developed as 10-year plans, with plans per each of those 10 years to get to universality in these big areas like childcare and preschool, where the coverage is much lower, to take into account that some states in the United States are further along and some states are further behind, and to kind of structure the incentives for states to contribute their own funding. Federal government is not designed to pay for all of this, but to kind of supplement states in terms of, for example, their preschool funding. And then what happened was, the 2017 first edition of the book was written for the Hillary Clinton administration. And then an event happened. We didn't have Hillary Clinton as president, but the focus turned to Congress and to different states. And so our team worked with states that had already been working on one or two areas of this policy, but wanted to expand their early childhood policies. And the same approach of developing a national costing proposal and a 10-year plan was done with states, working with state budget people in their legislatures or the governor's office. And so we worked in quite a few states, and there were advances in early childhood care and education policies as a result in several of these states, like Washington, Oregon, Colorado, California, and West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. Then, through a request from the UNICEF office in El Salvador and a national coalition there, we were asked to participate in creating a national early childhood development proposal for the country of El Salvador. So the same policy, process was done, which is kind of building on current programs and coverage in childcare and early education and family support and parenting programs. We developed a 10-year proposal for El Salvador that then became the basis for loans from the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank to become integrated. And the head, our liaison at UNICEF did something very unusual, which was to bring this proposals, and we engaged in dialogue with all 4 presidential candidates for the presidential election that happened about 6 years ago. And all 4 of those presidential candidates publicly, it was the only time they all got together at one meeting, they publicly endorsed the idea of a national ECD policy, and this became one of the inputs into what is currently Crecer Juntos, which means growing together, which is the national ECD policy currently being implemented in El Salvador. So we think the that this kind of team can be very productive in a particular technical area like early childhood development, to do some of the work that actually development banks like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank do, but where often in banks like that, the technical expertise folks are not necessarily the people working directly on country loans. But we think that in this case, for example, in the case of El Salvador, we kind of did the homework of a country technical team leader, and we're able to do this by bringing the combination of our content expertise in a particular sector like early education or childcare together with some capacity that we had ourselves to do some national level costing and work with demographers and the people who understand how policies would be actually utilized, at what rates would families, for example, actually use childcare if they were offered, make those assumptions, and develop cost estimates. So I'm going to conclude now by just talking about what are some of the conceptual, technical, and partnership skills that may be helpful if we as applied researchers are to actually engage in more policy dialogue. First, I think we do need to understand on-the-ground implementation of programs through extensive frontline program observation and knowledge. We cannot give up this kind of micro-knowledge that as developmental researchers we have about the nutritious supports for learning that can occur in settings, whether they are publicly funded childcare settings or in a parenting program or in a public preschool or in primary schooling. The sustained multi-year partnership skills with key policy actors, that's not something that is rewarded in academic settings, but we do think that academic priorities could potentially shift so that institutions recognize the kind of policy impact that that kind of work can have. And that it is a long-term process, but it does require some investment of time and energy. And this principle of listening to and answering policymakers' questions, and to support their work with systems that are already at scale. How do we make those systems better, not just scale, small scale innovations to large scale? And then finally, I think we want to, if not learn these kinds of demographic and costing skills, work with people who know those skills to be able to have the kinds of interdisciplinary teams that can then engage in the policy process productively. Thanks so much.